B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to start 6 lines from the top of the Omid. In the previous sugya on Daf Yud, we started at the bottom of Daf Yud Omid Aleph, a sugya of Kol Halishka is shehoyu b'mikdash lo hoyu lehen mezuzah. We started discussing the halachas of the mezuzah in the chamber of the Palhedrin and other chambers in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara is continuing with some of the ideas and the halachas of mezuzah, and we will get back to the Kodesh, to the Beis HaMikdash, a little bit later. Says the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon, Bish Orecha. We know that it says in the Pasuk, Uchsavta mal mezuzah is beisecha, uvish orecha, that you have to write a mezuzah, place a mezuzah on the doorposts of your homes and on your gates, on your entrances, the sha'orim. So the Brisa says, Echot sha'ari batim. This is the sha'orim, the gates, the openings into the homes of Echot sha'ari chatzeros, the gates into the courtyards of Echot sha'ari medinois, into the cities of Echot sha'ari ayoros. Also different types of cities and towns, and not all towns have openings, have gates, have entrances. Some cities are just open all around, but there are those that are surrounded by mountains, and there's a very unique and distinct way of entering the city, and there's a gates there, and those gates need to have a mezuzah. If, assuming, Rashi says, assuming that most of the inhabitants of the place are from Klal Yisrael. Yesh ben choivas mitzvah lemokim. Mishum shenemar uchsavtem al mezuzah is beisecha v'sharecha. There is a chiyuv to put mezuzah there, since that's what it says in the pasuk. Uchsavtem al mezuzah is beisecha, but not only on your homes, ubish orecha, on the gates too. Says the Gemara, Omalei Abaye l'Rav Safra, Hana avulei de mechuzah, the gates going into a place called mechuzah. Mai tamalei avdul hu rabbanon mezuzah. Why did the Chachamim not make sure there was a mezuzah there? Obviously, most of the people living there were from Israel, and we said that the gates going into cities and towns need to have a mezuzah. Omarle, so Rav Safra answered back to Abaya, Hanu chizuk le'akra dekubi hu da'avida. Those gates that were leading into this place mechuzah, they were there just to support the tower called Kubi, and towers were built on top of arches, and the arch under this tower, there happened to be an entranceway into the place, and since it was made in order to strengthen the tower on top of it, they felt there was no need to put mezuzah on the gateway in that entranceway. Omerle, so Abaya said back to Rav Safra, V'akro de kube gufa tiboya mezuzah. This entranceway, this gate underneath the tower, was actually the entranceway into the tower and into the city, and that in its own right should be necessary, should require a mezuzah. That's what Rashi says. They used to come into this tower through this entranceway. And the Gemara adds in, Deha isba dira l'shomer beis asurin. And I'm not sure why Rashi says a different explanation, but the Gemara says that this entranceway actually had in it a little home, a little dira, a little dwelling place for the guard of the prisoners that was sitting there. And that in itself is a reason that you should need to put a mezuzah on those gates. Do'atani, we learned in a brisa, Beis HaKnesses, a shul, sheyesh ba beis dira, in the event that there is a place, a room in that shul, in the building, where lechazna HaKnesses, for the chazna of the shul, could dwell in, then chayeves b'mezuzah, it's chayev b'mezuzah. So if so, why over here, why did the gates into mechuzah, why didn't they have a mezuzah? Even though the tower on top of it was supported on these gateways, but the gate in its own right should need a mezuzah. Elo Amar Abaya explained that, and Abaya heard the question and said that the reason that there was no mezuzah on the gates of mechuzah was not because they were there just to strengthen the tower on top of it, rather mishum sakona. It would have been dangerous to put a mezuzah on those gates. The Tanya we learned in a brisa, mezuzahs yochid, a private person's mezuzah, a mezuzah in a person's home, nivdekes pamayim b'shavua. Twice in 7 years, approximately once in 3.5 years, a person should check his mezuzahs. V'shel rabim, however, in mezuzahs that are in a public place, in courtyards, entrances into cities and towns, pamayim b'yovel, approximately once in 25 years, twice in a yovel. V'omer Rabbi Yehuda, And the reason for that is, as we're about to see, Maisa ba'artovin echod. There was this incident with this artovin, which was either the name of a person or the name of his profession. Shahaya boidik mezuzos b'shuk ha'elyon shel tzipuri. He was accustomed to checking people's mezuzos in the marketplace, the upper marketplace in Tzipuri. Umatzui kazdor echod, and an officer found him checking the mezuzos, v'notal mimenu elef zuz, and fined him 1,000 zuz. Why? Because he thought that he was engaged in witchcraft. And for that reason, they would only check the mezuzahs in public places much more rarely. And for that reason, Abaye said, in the entranceway of the place mechuzah, they chose not to put any mezuzah because they knew that there would be the moishel, the ruler of the place, would use it as an excuse to accuse Klal Yisrael and to make trouble for the Eden who were living there, thinking that they were engaged in witchcraft, putting all sorts of amulets at the entrance of a city, and therefore they didn't do it. Asks the Gemara of Omer Belazar, Shluche mitzvah ein nizokin. We have a rule we saw in Psochim Daf Ches and in other places that people who are on their way to doing a mitzvah have a special protection and do not get hurt. And therefore here too, putting a mezuzah, checking mezuzahs and putting a mezuzah on the doors, on the gates, that should protect us from any harm. Says the Gemara, no. Heichad de kvia zeika shani, in a place where it's common that there should be a damage, or in a place where it's susceptible to be hurt, then we don't use the rule of shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin. And since the rulers were always looking for excuses to cause trouble to the Yidden, that's called shchiach hazeika, that the damages are common, and therefore we do not use the rule of shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin. Where would we find proof for this in Psukim, that even though shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin, but if it's shchiach hazeika, then we do not rely on that extra protection. T'chsiv, it says in the pasuk, Vayomer Shmuel, and we have to remember, we're talking here about Hashem told Shmuel, a Novi, told him, go and anoint David HaMelech and make him the next king. An explicit mitzvah, an explicit command by Hashem. What did Shmuel say to Hashem? He didn't say, of course I'm going. Shmuel said, Eich Eilech, how can I go? V'shama Shaul. And Shaul, who was the previous king, will hear that I'm coming to anoint David HaMelech Vargoni, and he's going to kill me. Vayomer Hashem didn't say to him, I told you to go, why are you asking questions? Hashem said, you're right. Eglas bokor tikach, take a calf with you, biodecha, in your hands. Vomarton, when you go, you should say, Lizboach Lashem Basi, no, I'm just coming innocently to bring a korban. Whilst you're there, you'll anoint David HaMelech. So you see clearly that even though there was a mitzvah from Hashem, how he could not rely on shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin, because Shaul was on the lookout for the people who were trying to undermine his kingdom. He had something against David HaMelech. You look in there in the Shmuel Aleph, the whole story, and therefore Shmuel did not want to rely on shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin, and therefore Hashem told him, take a korban with you, take an animal with you. So you see there clearly that you do not use the rule of shluchei mitzvah eino nizokin where it's shchicha hazeika. Now, before we start the next Gemara, I want to make a short introduction, and then the Gemara will be very safe sailing. The Gemara is going to discuss the requirement of mezuzah in different types of buildings, different types of rooms. We know that beisecha, anything which is a home, which is used for dwelling, for residence, is chayev in mezuzah. What happens if you have rooms that are used, they're used by people but not for people? Or maybe it's more accurately used for people, not by people. What do I mean? You have all sorts of storage rooms where you're storing straw, animals, wood, other storage. And that's what we're going to discuss now. Now, these storage rooms, they could be used for one of three things. Number one is called stoma. Stoma means that it's just, we take it for granted that they are used primarily just for what they're made for. Stoma, that means they're used for storing of straw, and this one to store animals, and here to store woods, and wherever it may be, it's used for storage. That means there's no intent for a person to actually use it for their own type of residence, for their own uses. They just use it to store their items there, and the animals, and to use it as storage. That's called stoma. And then you have a case where it actually is used. It's not a regular room. It's not a person's bedroom or dining room. It's a storage room for animals or wood or whatever it may be. But women would go in there to be miskashtos, to adorn themselves. That means it would be used by women who wanted to do modestly to do their updos or whatever they were doing, and it's called that they would go in there mekashtos. And that would be a little bit more reason to be chayev mezuzah, even more than stoma, where in stoma it's not really used by a person. People don't go in there and use the room in and of itself. And then you have another category, which is roichatzos, which is actually a step further away from being chayev mezuzah, which is even further removed from mezuzah than stoma. And that's where women would go in there to bathe. And bathing is something where typically a woman would be inappropriately dressed. It's appropriate to be dressed that way or not dressed that way in the bathing room, but since she's that level of dress, it's inappropriate to hang a mezuzah there. And those are the three things, and often women would use these storerooms in order to bathe there. It's very humble, it's out the way, and they would go into some storeroom and bathe there. So the question is, stoma, these oitzros, these storage places that are just stoma, are they chayev mezuzah or not? That's one fundamental question. Another question will be in the event that it's miskashtos, then even if you said that stoma was potter from mezuzah, does miskashtos make it chayev? And on the other side, even if stoma was chayev, does roichatzos make it potter? That's going to be the big discussion here. And we're going to see in the Gemara that everybody agrees that roichatzos, that a room that's used for activities that are inappropriate to have a mezuzah there, those rooms are potter from mezuzah. Regarding stoma, that's going to be a machlokas between Rav Kahana and Rav Yehuda. Rav Kahana says that there's actually going to be a machlokas tanoim if stoma is chayev or stoma is potter. Rav Yehuda is going to argue and say that everybody agrees stoma is potter, and there's going to be machlokas whether if it's miskashtos, if women go into these storerooms in order to adorn themselves, if that makes it chayev or potter, that's going to be a machlokas tanoim. Now this is just a basic overview, and it's going to be based on an analysis of 5 brises. We're going to analyze 5 different brises, and obviously the brises are tanoim. Rav Kahana and Rav Yehuda are meiroim, and we're going to have to see how Rav Kahana and Rav Yehuda weave their way between these brises to uphold their own opinions. And at the end we'll see that there's going to be one brisa that's going to disprove Rabbi Yehuda, that's going to refute Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and Rav Kahana's opinion will stand. Says the Gemara, Toni Rav Kahana kamed Rav Yehuda. Rav Kahana said the following brisa to Rav Yehuda, and this is brisa number 1. And we'll note what the brisa actually says explicitly and what's not explicit in the brisa. The brisa says Beis HaTeven, a storeroom for straw, Beis HaBokor, where animals are stored, or Beis HaEitzim for wood, or Beis HaOitzros, or other storage, Peturin min hamezuzah. They are potter. And the brisa says the following 4 words, that the reason is mipnei shehanoshim ne'oisos bohen, because women use those rooms. We have to know what that means. The brisa says they're potter because they use the rooms. It's very ambiguous. Says the Gemara, first and foremost, this is Rav Kahana saying, let's first understand what ne'oisos means. Says Rav Kahana, ne'oisos, what does it mean? My ne'oisos, roichatzos. That the reason that in all these places there's no chiyuv of mezuzah is because the women are ne'oisos, they use it, and Rashi says it means a term of having hana, pleasure there. They're bathing there, and therefore it's potter. That's how Rav Kahana understood the explanation of the brisa of ne'oisos. Amalei Rav Yehuda. Now Rav Yehuda commented to Rav Kahana and said, just a minute, if you're explaining the brisa that the only reason that these storage rooms are potter is because women are bathing there, Tama dereichatzos, ha stoma chayovin. So you, Rav Kahana, hold that if not for the fact they were bathing there, if it was just storage rooms stoma, then you would say that they are chayev. Well, says Rav Yehuda, I have a problem with that. V'otanya, I've got a brisa. This is brisa number 2. We'll soon see what Rabbi Yehuda is going to do with brisa number 1. But at first, he's disproving Rav Kahana's approach to brisa number 1 from brisa number 2. What we're going to see in brisa number 2, we're going to see explicitly that stoma is potter. Because it says that refes bokor, a barn for cattle, p'tura min mezuzah. It doesn't say it's only potter if women are bathing there. It says stoma. A barn is potter from mezuzah. So Rabbi Yehuda determines from this brisa number 2, that stoma is potter. So if so, we have an issue with brisa number 1. In brisa number 1, it says that it's only potter because mepnei shanoshim na'osos bohen. If stoma is potter, it should be potter without any because. Says that Rabbi Yehuda is actually going to change the first brisa. Elamai na'osos. What does na'osos mean? First of all, na'osos doesn't mean bathing, it means miskashtos. They adorn themselves there. If so, the question comes back, how can you say that the reason that it's potter from mezuzah is because women adorn themselves there? That doesn't read. If anything, the fact that women adorn themselves there is the reason to be chayav mezuzah, not potter. V'hachik toni. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to read it the other way around. Not mipnei, because women adorn themselves there. Afal pi, even though she'anoshim miskashtes bohen p'turin. Which means that Rabbi Yehuda holds potter. And he reads into the first brisa, not only is stoma potter, but even miskashtes doesn't help and is potter. Omer Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana said to Rav Yehuda, so you Rabbi Yehuda are saying what? Number one, you're arguing with me. I, Rav Kahana, said stoma is chayev. You Rabbi Yehuda say stoma is potter, and you brought brisa number 2 for that. Okay. Maybe we'll come back to that. But you, Rabbi Yehuda, hold from brisa number 1, the way you understand brisa number 1, that if women are miskashtos, it doesn't help. And it's also potter from mezuzah. Well, I've got an issue with that. From brisa number 3, are you suggesting that noshim miskashtos is potter? So according to Rav Kahana himself, he wouldn't have an issue, because he says even if they're not miskashtos, even stoma, it's chayev. You, Rabbi Yehuda, are choosing to argue with me with stoma, and you're telling me that not only is stoma potter, but even miskashta is potter. Here I have an explicit brisa against you. Brisa number 3, v'otanya, refes bokor, p'tura min mezuzah, that a barn is potter from mezuzah, v'shahanoshim miskashta is bo, chayeves b'mezuzah. However, if women are adorning themselves there, then even though the beginning of this brisa seems to say, or does say, that stoma is potter, refes boka p'tura min mezuzah, and we'll soon see that Rav Kahana is going to have to deal with that, because Rav Kahana holds stoma is chayev, as we saw from the way he understood the first brisa, that that's only potter because reichatzos. So we'll soon see Rav Kahana is going to establish it's a machlokas tanoim, so it's okay. So refes boka p'tura min mezuzah, that's stoma. However, shanoshim miskashtos, it's explicit in the brisa that if women are adorning themselves there, then chayeves b'mezuzah, then that room is chayev b'mezuzah. And according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, you're learning in the first brisa that the reason that the brisa says potter afal pi shanoshim miskashtos, the way you're learning the first brisa is contrary to what it says explicitly in brisa number 3. So how are you, Rabbi Yehuda, going to explain this? What are you going to say? You're going to say miskashtos tanoihi. You're going to say that there's a machlekas tanoim whether miskashtos is chayev or miskashtos is potter. You're going to have to say that because you learned the first brisa to say miskashtos is potter, and brisa number 3 says explicitly miskashtos is chayev. So if so, l'didi nami, Rav Kahana is now justifying himself, saying I also hold stoma tanoihi, even though I said that Rav Kahana said that stoma is chayev, and you, Rabbi Yehuda, had a problem and said, what do you mean, how can you say stoma is chayev? You brought brisa number 2 to say that stoma is potter. Well, I'll tell you, it's a machlokas tanoim. Like you have to say it's a machlokas tanoim if miskashtos is chayev or potter. Well, I'll tell you that it's a machlokas tanoim if stoma is chayev or potter. And therefore, there's no issue between Rav Kahana, the way I explained brisa number 1 that stoma is chayev, and brisa number 3 that stoma is potter. The Tanya. And now we're going to take brisa number 4, and brisa number 4 actually explicitly has a machlokas tanoim, and we're going to see that Rav Kahana is going to understand the machlokas tanoim as being a machlokas if stoma is chayev or not, and Rav Yehuda is going to explain that brisa as being a machlokas whether miskashtos is chayev or potter, and Rav Yehuda will see in that brisa that stoma is going to be potter according to both opinions, and then everything so far will be okay. The Tanya, what does it say in brisa number 4? Beisecha, We know that it says in the Pasuk, Uchsavtom al mezuzah is beisecha uvish orecha. Beisecha, the basic translation would be hamayuchad lecha. It's a home that's unique for you. Prat. And this excludes types of homes that are not used for your own personal dwelling, your own personal residence, but you're using it for storage, for other things. Lebeis hateven, or lebeis habokor, or lebeis ha'etzim, or lebeis ha'otzreis, that we saw before. Shepturin min hamezuzah. The Tanakhama say that all these things, beis hateven, beis habokor, etc., they are potur from mezuzah. V'yesh mechayvim. A second opinion, a yesh oimrim, the second opinion says chayiv. That's stage one of the brisa. That there's just a machlekes potter chayiv, and we don't yet know potter why, potter when. The brisa doesn't really tell us. The brisa seems to be talking about even stoma, but we'll come to that. The next part of the brisa is be'emes amru. The truth is that beis hakise, a place where a person relieves themselves, or beis habursaki, a tannery that has very bad smell, or beis hamerchatz, a bathhouse, or beis hatfila, where people go into the mikveh. And a room where women women use, for those it's inappropriate to have a mezuzah, and therefore it's potter, and it's similar to the roichatzois potter that we saw before. Everybody agrees with that. So this is the end of the brisa. The first part of the brisa is talking about all those storage houses where it's a machloikas in the brisa, and then you have the second part of the brisa speaking about those places which are inappropriate for mezuzah. Everybody agrees that there's no chi of mezuzah. So that's just the brisa. And then obviously Rav Kahana is going to explain it his way, and Rav Kahana is going to, Rav Kahana himself holds there's a machloikas whether stoma is chayav or not. He's going to read that into the brisa. Rav Yehuda, who holds that everybody agrees stoma is potur, he's going to have to read into the brisa that the machlokes is when it's miskashtos. Rav Kahana mataretz l'tamei. Rav Kahana is going to read into this brisa to follow his own perception of the sugya. Rav Yehuda mataretz l'tamei. Rav Kahana mataretz l'tamei. How's Rav Kahana going to read this brisa? Let's remember Rav Kahana holds that there's a machlokes tanoim whether stoma is potur or stoma is chayev. Rav Kahana read into the first brisa that stoma is chayev, and the third brisa says explicitly stoma, and the second brisa, said explicitly, and the third brisa for that matter said explicitly that stoma is potur. It's a machlokes tanoim, and these are the machlokes tanoim. Where beisecha. It says in the pasuk beisecha, and now we're reading the brisa again through the glasses of Rav Kahana. Beisecha miyuchad lecha. Who's chayiv mezuzah? Only if it's unique for your own personal residence. Prat lebeis hateven, lebeis habokor, lebeis ha'etzim, lebeis ha'otzreis, shepturim min hamezuzah, bistam. Is Rav Kahana added this in, that the Tanakhama who say that potur, stoma is potur. V'yeshem chayvin, and the opinion that argues and says chayiv, bistam, says a machlokes tanoim by stoma. And be'emes amru. How's Rav Kahana reading the last part of the brisa? Beis hakise, or beis habursaki, or beis hamerchatz, or beis hatfila, v'shanoshim na'osos behen. What does na'osos behen mean according to Rav Kahana? My na'osos roichatzois, and roichatzois. Everybody agrees that, and that's Rav Kahana himself understood that in the first brisa that roichatzois is potur. It's inappropriate to have a mezuzah there. And that's how he understands the second part of this brisa number 4, the apturim min mezuzah. Now the Gemara is asking, if you, Rav Kahana, explain the brisa that the end of this brisa, when it says that noshim na'osos pen, that noshim use it, is that they are bathing there, we have an issue with that because a few words earlier the brisa said beis hamerchatz. It said beis hamerchatz u beis hatvila v'shanoshim na'osos ben. Noshim na'osos ben. What does that mean? According to Rav Kahana, they're bathing. So beis hatvila is a place where there's no odor at all. There's no zuamo. However, beis hamerchatz and noshim na'osos ben is the same thing. Why does it say it twice according to Rav Kahana? Yihacha hainu merchatz. Answers the Gemara, no. Shmi'inon is coming to impress on us merchatz de rabim v'shmi'inon merchatz de yochid. To tell us not only is a public bathhouse where there's a lot of odor and zuamo there and bad smell, but even in a private bathhouse, a private bathroom, so to speak, there's also an exemption of mezuzah there. So I may have thought merchatz derabim, only a public bathhouse, the nofish zuamo, that there's a very strong and bad odor. That's when it's potter. Avol merchatz yochid deloy nofish zuamo, eimel chayev b'mezuzah. I may have thought that is chayev mezuzah. Komash maron the chiddush is that even there it's potter. So we've had a very clear reading of Brisa number 4, according to Rav Kahana, that there's a machlokes in the Brisa where the stoma is chayev, stoma is potter, and Rav Kahana explained Brisa number 1 according to the opinion that stoma is chayev. Brisa number 2 and 3 is according to the opinion that stoma is potter. Now it's Rav Yehuda's turn to explain the Brisa number 4. Rav Yehuda mataretz l'tamei. Let's remember, Rav Yehuda held that everybody says stoma is potter. Nobody says stoma is chayev. So Rav Yehuda is going to explain the Brisa as follows. Hochik toni. Now we're going to start reading the Brisa again from Rabbi Yehuda's perception. Beisecha, beischa miyuchad lecha. Who's required a mezuzah? A home that's unique for your own dwelling. Prat lebeis hateven, ubeis habokor, ubeis haitzim, ubeis ha'oitzreis ha'pturim in mezuzah. When is it potter? Afilu b'miskashtes. That it's potter even if miskashtes. Rabbi Yehuda says that everybody says stoma is potter. That was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The Tanakama say potter even if women use it to adorn themselves. The yesh mechayvin is not by stoma. It's by miskashtos. It's only when it's miskashtos that's when it's going to be chayev. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we have a machlokes tanoim here whether miskashtos is chayev or potter. Aval stam, but if it's not miskashto, if it's stoma, divrei hakel potter. Everybody agrees that it's potter. So Rabbi Yehuda explained Brisa number 1 that miskashtos is potter. Brisa number 3 said explicitly miskashtos is chayev. No problem. It's a machlokes tanoim. How's Rav Yehuda reading the continuation of the Brisa? Be'emes amru beis hakisi, beis habursaki, beis hamerchatz, beis hatvila, afal pisha noshim miskashtos bohen. He learns that over there, all these places that are beis hakisi, etc., even if noshim are miskashtos bohen, even if the women are adorning themselves there, and we said that by stoma, Rabbi Yehuda says potter, but if miskashtos, that's a reason to be mechayev. That's only a regular storage room. But all these other rooms which are inappropriate to have a mezuzah, even if women adorn themselves there, and in and of its own, adorning oneself is a reason to be chayev mezuzah, at least according to one opinion, nonetheless, pturim min mezuzah, in these rooms that are generally used for in activities that are inappropriate to be witnessed by a mezuzah, then it's pturim min mezuzah mishum denofish zuame, because it's a very strong and bad odor there, and therefore it's potter from mezuzah. So far, everything is working out. Now comes the very big, the final Brisa number 5, that's going to tip the scales. Because as of now, we haven't yet had a single Brisa that says explicitly that stoma is chayev. And if we find such a Brisa, we're going to have an issue with Rav Yehuda. Because Rav Yehuda says that everybody agrees stoma is potter, and the whole machlekes is if it's miskashtos. Here comes that Brisa. Well, Rav Yehuda, stoma, divrei hakel potter. You, Rav Yehuda, hold that by stoma, everybody says it's potter. V'otanya, we have Brisa number 5. Bish orecha. It says in the pasuk that the gates also are chayev in mezuzah. Echod shari batim, echod shari chatzeros. We saw this at the beginning of the shir today. Echod shari medinos, echod shari ayoris. Verefes. Here, till now we saw in the Brisa at the beginning of the Omer today. But here the Brisa carries on. Ve'echot shari verefes, and barns for animals, velulin and chicken coops, matvon and places where straw is stored, v'oitzros yain, where wine is stored, v'oitzros shemen and oil. All these chayovin b'mezuzah. It's talking about stoma, and it says explicitly chayev. And the Brisa is now going to continue with another 3 brackets of halacha in mezuzah, but from here alone we have refuted Rav Yehuda. But let's first continue and finish the Brisa. Yochil shani marbe, I may have thought there's a chiyuv mezuzah af also in a second bracket of entrances. For example, Beis Shar, which is a gatehouse where everybody just walks through it, achsadra, a porch, marpeset, and a balcony. I may have thought that all those are also chayev. Talmud Leiman, no, bayis, ma bayis miyuchad ledira. In the same way as bayis is unique, that it's used for dwelling and for residence, yatsu elu, but all these which nobody dwells in them, she'ein miyuchadim ledira. Yochel, let's take bracket number 3. I may have thought Shani Marbe that one's chayiv mezuzah af beis hakisei, beis haburusik, beis hamerchatz, beis hatvila. All these places that we've learned already are inappropriate to have a mezuzah there. Talmud leima bayis, on the fact that the pasuk says that mezuzah only goes to bayis. Ma bayis are also lekovid, in the same way as bayis is typically a place where one does things that are respectable. Afkola also lekovid. Only when it's a respectable type of residence and use, then you put mezuzah. But in those rooms where one does things that are that little bit less kovid, there's no chiyuv mezuzah. Yatsu elu she'ein asuyin lekovid. And now the 4th bracket. Yochel shani marbe, I may have thought there's a chiyuv af harabayis, the gates, the entrances into the harabayis, uvalishkois, va'azoris, that in the different chambers and the azoris in the Beis Hamikdash, I may have thought there's a chiyuv mezuzah there. Talmud leima bayis, ma bayis shu choil, in the same way as a typical home is choil, it's not kodesh. Afkol shu choil, yatsu elu shem kodesh. In the Beis Hamikdash, the harabayis, the Beis Hamikdash, which is kodesh, kodesh is exempt from mezuzah. So this is the brisa. But in the first part of the brisa, we saw explicitly that all these storehouses, Stoma chayavim b'mezuzah. That's not like Rav Yehuda. Says the Gemara Tufta, indeed it's a refutation against Rav Yehuda's opinion, and Rav Kahana's opinion stands that Stoma is actually a machlokes tanoim. Continues the Gemara. Toni Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda kamei derava. Shisha sha'arim p'turim min ha-mezuzah. 6 gates are potter from mezuzah. Let's count. 1, Beis HaTeven, a storage room for straw. 2, Beis HaBokor, where animals are kept. 3, Ubeis ha'etzim, where wood is kept. 4, Ubeis ha'otzreis, other storage. 5, V'shar ha'modai, an arched doorway, an arched gateway. 6, V'shar she'enei mekura, and a gate that doesn't have any roof. 7, V'shar she'enei gevay ha'asara, or a gate, an entranceway that's not 10 tefachim high. Omar Lei, Rav responded to Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Patachta b'shisha, you opened up your comments, your teaching, saying that there's going to be 6 gates, v'silakta b'shiva, and then you continued and numbered 7 of them. Omar Lei. So Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said to Rav, you're right, but one of them was not included in the 6. One of them is not unanimously agreed upon. Shar HaModai, regarding an arched entranceway, Tanoi here, it's actually machlokes Tanoim. The Tanya we learnt in the following brisa, Kippah, an arched doorway. And before we continue the brisa, let's try and understand what's clear. What's clear is that to be chayiv mezuzah, you need a door that's at least 4 tefachim wide and 10 tefachim high. And that's an exact 40 square tefachim of entranceway. What happens if, and we know that very often, entranceways are arched, which means that they start off wide enough, but the time you reach the top of the entranceway, then they come to a point, or almost a point, they're curved. There's no, the highest most point of the entranceway is no 4 tefachim wide. So obviously, if you have an airspace of 4 wide and 10 high, and the arch is beyond that, there's nothing to discuss. It's a regular doorway, of course you're chayiv b'mezuzah. The question is going to be, what happens if it starts curving and gets less than 4 tefachim wide before the height of 10 tefachim? So we're going to see that the whole discussion only starts if at least for 3 tefachim off the ground you have 4 tefachim wide. Because up to 3 tefachim, we learned about this earlier in Shas, up to 3 tefachim off the ground is just considered like a thick layer of ground. So if the doorway is only 4 tefachim wide, for the height of 2 tefachim, that's not considered a doorway at all. There's nothing to discuss. Everyone says there's no chiyuv mezuzah. If you have at least 3 tefachim of doorway, which is 4 tefachim wide, so now there's what to talk about. But so the problem is that before the doorway reaches the height of 10 tefachim, it starts curving, and then the width becomes less than 4 tefachim. That's going to be the discussion. And they're going to discuss only the following situation. In the event that the doorway, that the door frame itself is completely curved, not just the entranceway is carved out of a large wall or a larger wall, and it's carved out as a curve. But if the whole doorway is a curve, then there's nothing to talk about either. Because even if you wanted to imagine that you would have an imaginary type of door that's carved into the wall, that wouldn't help, because there's no wall to carve into. And you'll see in some of the Gemaras as a diagram, if you have a triangle, if you have a doorway, that the whole door frame comes to a point, there's nothing to imagine that you could carve out, then again, everybody agrees that this doorway is potter from mezuzah. The question will be, and some of you will see this in a second diagram on the sides of your Gemaras, where you have a large wall, that theoretically they could have carved into the wall a doorway which is a full 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide. They just chose, for whichever reason, to carve the entranceway, but potentially they could carve out of the wall, not to curve the entranceway, but potentially they could carve out of the wall the rest of the doorway. That's going to be a machlokes tanoim. Let's see this inside. The Tanya we learned in a brayso kippah, an arched doorway. Reb Meir mechayev b'mezuzah v'chachamim p'turim. Reb Meir says chayev, the chachamim say potur. V'shovin, they both agree shem yesh beraglo asoro shechayovim b'mezuzah. Everybody agrees that if the door posts are 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide before it starts curving, then definitely it's chayev. Omar Rabbi. Abaya says the kuli alma gavoya asoro ve'ein beraglo gimel v'lav klumhu. Everybody agrees that even if the centermost point, the highest most point in the doorway is 10 tvachim high, but if at the foot of the doorway, the foot posts, the 3 tvachim closest to the ground, are not 4 tvachim apart, v'lav klumhu, there's nothing doing, and the doorway is not considered the doorway, and it's potter. They're only arguing if the highest most point in the doorway is 10 tvachim off the ground. V'yesh beraglo gimel, and you've got the lowest 3 tvachim of the doorposts are 4 tvachim apart. Ve'ein berach daled, but the rest, from above the 3 tvachim, it's curving, and therefore you haven't got a width of 4 tvachim all the way to the top. However, but you do have a wall into which potentially, theoretically, or imaginary, you could carve into it a full 4 tvachim width of the whole 10 tvachim height. In that case, Reb Meir says, you imagine that it's been carved out of the wall and the door is a proper door and it's chayev. Rabbanon Savri, the Chachamim say, all the while that the entranceway doesn't have an actual 4 tvachim wide by 10 tvachim high, the door is potter from mezuzah. Continues the Gemara. We're continuing with mezuzah. Tanu Rabbanon, Beis HaKnesses, a shul, Ubeis HaIsha, a room belonging to a woman, Ubeis HaShutfin, or a house belonging to partners, Chayeves b'mezuzah. They are all chayev b'mezuzah. Says the Gemara Pshita. What's the chiddush? Why shouldn't they be chayev b'mezuzah? The people dwell in them, people use them. What's the difference if the person inside is a woman or if it belongs to partners? Says the Gemara, no. Ma'odatema, I may have thought that since it says in the pasuk beisecha, meaning yours, and cha is yours in masculine terms, v'loi beisa, it's yours male, not yours a woman. Beischa v'loi botehem, yours in singular, not yours in plural. And I may have thought that a woman or partners are potter. Kumash malon, that's the chiddush of this brayso, is telling us that you're chayev. Ve'ema hachanami. So the question is, who told the brayso? Maybe it's true that the way that we're reading beisecha, and indeed a woman's home or the home of partners are going to be potter. Who told you that you're chayev? Omar Cross says the Gemara, no, because the pasuk says in the parish of mezuzah, "Leman yirbu yumeichem v'meiv menechem." In the merit of mezuzah, you'll have longevity, your children will have a long life. Hanu boyechaya v'hanu loy boyechaya. Do these people, partners and women, not need or want life? Of course they do, and therefore logic dictates that they're chayev with mezuzah. And the chiddush is, don't read the pasuk and say that Beischa is excluding them. The question is, Elo Beischa Lomali. So why does the Torah say Beischa if it's clear to us that it's not what it actually means? Says the Gemara Kedarova, Beischa is actually teaching us something else. We read Beischa, it sounds similar and it's similar letters to Bi'oscha. You're coming in, you're entering. The Omarova Derech Bi'oscha. The place on the doorpost, put the mezuzah, is similar to the way that you enter. V'chi okar inishkari. When a person enters, when a person starts walking and starts moving, what does he do? Do you mina okar bereisha? The first foot that he lifts is the right-hand foot. So this is coming to teach us when you're going into a room, the mezuzah has to go derech bioscho. It has to go on the right-hand doorpost of the doorway. Continues the Gemara. Tanya edach another brisa. Beis hakneses u beis hashutfin. And now we're moving away from mezuzah and we're going to negoim. And we know there's a halacha that on a person's home, it's possible for a person's home to have tzaras, to have a boil, to have a stain on the wall, and then the kohen has to come, depending on the color, on the size, etc., where the kohen will say, this is tzoras, and a whole procedure. So the question is, what type of home would become tomei, or would have the halachas of negoim? Beis hakneses, a shul, or beis hashutfin, a home belonging to partners, or beis ha'isha, and a home of a woman, metamin b'negoim. Their homes are called bayis, and therefore, since it's bayis, the tzaras, the negoim, can apply to them. Says the Gemara Pshita. What's the chiddush? Why shouldn't it be a bayis? Says the Gemara. Ma'odatei I may have thought, since it says in the pasuk, uvo asher loy habayis, v'higid lakoyin leimer kenega nir li babayis, that the owner, the person asher loy, to him is a home. He comes and tells the kohen that I've seen a nega in my home, on my home. The word loy, similar to the chof, to the beis cho we saw before, the loy seems to be his. His as in single tense, and his as in male, not female. So I may have thought, Ma'odatei bo asher loy habayis. Loy means him, v'loy lo, and not her. Loy means him, v'loy lo hen, and not them, partners, kumash malon. So the Bryce is coming to impress on us that negoim could apply. Who told you? Maybe you're right, that negoim can only apply to his male home. Says the Gemara, no. Or makro, because there's another pasuk. The pasuk says, Ki savoyu el eretz Canaan, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, ashani noisei nochem la'achuzah, that I'm giving to you as an inheritance, v'nosati nega tzoras b'veis eretz achuzaschem, and in the place, in the land of your inheritance, that's where negoim could apply. So you see from there that any land that's been inherited, that belongs to you, can have negoim. And even partners inherited Eretz Yisrael, and even women inherited Eretz Yisrael. If so, asks the Gemara, Elo loy, why indeed does the pasuk say that who comes to the kohen, loy, him? Why do you use that term loy if you don't mean that term? Lomoli. Answers the Gemara that loy means who's going to get tzaras on his home. And the consequences of having tzaras, a worst case scenario, is that the whole home has to be knocked down, not before all the contents of the home are removed from the home. Do you know who's going to be deserving of a punishment like that? Misha miyachid beisoy loy. Somebody who's got tzaras ayin. Somebody who's very miserish. Somebody who doesn't want to share his objects or anything, that his belongings, with somebody else. Somebody who's miyachid his home just for himself. He doesn't want to lend his neighbors any of his property, any of his belongings. And he tells his neighbor, I'm sorry, I haven't got. The neighbor came and asked for a utensil or asked for something, and this miser says, no, I'm sorry, I haven't got. You haven't got? Hashem says, I'll show everybody what you do have. When you have to empty out your home, and you have to empty your home because of tzaras, everybody will see that you do have, and it's just your bad midas why you're not lending it to them. So when it says loy, it's not coming to exclude her, it's not coming to exclude them, it's coming to exclude prat lemashal kelov lachirim. Somebody who's kind and is lending his utensils and his property to other people, his belongings to other people, that person will not be deserving and will not have negoim in his home. Continues the Gemara that we just saw at the beginning of this second brisa, ubeis hakneses mimatami b'negoim. We saw in the brisa that a shul is subject to tzaras, to negoim. A shul can have negoim. Well, Tanya, this seems to contradict a different brisa. The brisa says, "Yochel you boti knesiyos boti midrashis mitamin b'negoim." I may have thought that shuls, places where you daven, places where you learn, Beis HaMedrash, could become tomei with negoim. Talmud Loima, it says in the pasuk, "Ubo asher loy habayis," that only somebody who is loy, where a home that belongs to him, he comes to the kohen will come and say it's tzaras. Only misha miyuchid loy, only when it's unique to him. Yotzu elu, that means it's unique, it has identified owners. We know who the owners are. You know who the owners are, that type of home can have nagoim. But yotzu elu, the exclusion of shuls, botiknesiyos and botimidyoshos, she'ein miyuchadim loy. You don't know who the owners are. It's not clear who the owners are. Maybe it's not unique to him. We'll soon see exactly how to read this, the miyuchadim loy. But you see here clearly, in the Brisa, that since a shul is einon miyuchadim loy, therefore there's no tzaras applying there. And that's contrary to what we saw in the Brisa on the first of the wide lines, that Beis HaKnesses or Beis HaShutfin, etc., is metamin ben nagoim. That's a stira, a contradiction the Gemara asks. And the Gemara is going to give a number of possible answers. Loi kasha, the first one is Horeb Mea, Horabonon. We're about to see a machlokas tanoim, and the brisa that says that shuls can become tomei is Reb Meir, and the brisa that says shuls cannot become tomei is the Rabbonon. The Tani we learned in a brisa, Beis HaKnesses sheyesh bo dira lechazna HaKnesses. A shul has a room there where the chazan can actually dwell there and use it as his own. He's using it there. Chayev b'mezuzah. However, if the shul is uniquely used just to daven in or just to learn in, but there's nobody who's actually dwelling there, then it's a machleikas. Reb Meir mechayev, v'chachamim poitrin. Reb Meir says nonetheless the shul is chayev b'mezuzah, and the chachamim say potter. So what do you see from here? There's a machleikas regarding a shul that does not have a beis dira. Nobody dwells there. There's a machleikas Reb Meir and the chachamim whether it's called bayis regarding mezuzah. We assume the same will apply to Nagoim. According to Reb Meir, who says it's chayiv b'mezuzah, it's called a bayis, Reb Meir will say that these shuls will also be able to become tomei. It's a bayis. However, the chachomim who say it's potter, because there's no beis dira there, nobody dwells there, so he'll say the same by Nagoim, that the shuls will be potter. That was one answer. Another suggested answer, Rabbonon. Both brises could be following the Rabbonon, who say that when there's no beis dira, then there's no chiyuv mezuzah. It's not called bayis. So how are you going to explain the contradiction? V'lo kashya. Beis dira. The brisa that says that a shul is subject to nagoim is talking about a type of shul which has a beis dira. And then it's called a bayis. And the brisa that says the shul doesn't have nagoim is talking about a type of shul where there's no beis dira. Third suggestion. It could be that both brises are talking about a shul that does not have a dwelling place, a room where somebody uses as a dira. And what's the difference between the two brises? There's a very big difference between the shuls in the big cities, which do not become tomei with nagoim, and the shuls in the little villages that they do become tomei. What's the difference between them? Because in the shuls in the city, the owners are not identified. We don't know who the owners are, because everybody comes, everybody uses them, people from out of town, everybody's using it. So it does not have a very distinct and discernible owners. And therefore, it's potter. There's no nagoim there. However, where the villages, where the shul serves only the people in this village and everybody knows exactly who's using the shul, that type of shul can have nagoim. Asks the Gemara, Udekrochim ein metame b'nagoim? Are you suggesting that regarding the krochim, the shuls of the big city, that there's no tzaras can apply to them because so many people are using it and it's not nikar? Rashi says that the bail of nikorim, you cannot see who the owners are, and that's the reason to exempt a person from, to exempt this place from nagoim. Votani we learned in a brisa regarding tzaras. The pasuk says, and we mentioned this pasuk before, that tzaras applies bebeis eretz achuzaschem, in the homes of the land that you've inherited. Achuzaschem metame b'nagoim. Only if you inherited it, then there's a chiyuv of nagoim. Ve'ein Yerushalayim metame b'nagoim. Yerushalayim is different. Yerushalayim was never inherited by the Shvatim, by the tribes. We'll soon see this opinion holds that Yerushalayim was not given out to the tribes, only the rest of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the Yerushalayim, the homes in Yerushalayim don't belong to anybody, and therefore they don't have Nagoim. But what do we see from here? That besides for Yerushalayim, everywhere else in Eretz Yisrael, there's a chiyuv, the Nagoim applies. Even in the big cities. So how can you say that in the big cities, the Nagoim doesn't apply to the shuls there? Omer Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda responded in the Brisa, responded to the Tanakama, Ani lo shomati, elo mokim migdosh bilvad. I only heard that the Beis HaMikdash didn't belong to specific people. However, the rest of Yerushalayim does belong to specific people, and therefore Tzaras can apply even in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a krochim, is a big city. How can you say that in Yerushalayim, in the shuls in Yerushalayim, there's Tzaras, where we said before, according to this third answer in the Gemara, we said that in the shuls in a big city don't have Tzaras. Says the Gemara, Ha botik nesiya is a botim mejoshos. Besides to the Beis HaMikdash, metamin benegoim afal gav de krochim ninu. Yerushalayim is a big city, and nonetheless, only the Beis HaMikdash doesn't have tzaras, but shuls and botim mejosh do have tzaras, and that's the question. Answers the Gemara, Ema. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Ani lo shomati elo moki mekudosh bilvad. Rabbi Yehuda actually commented and said that Ani lo shomati, I only heard that in holy places, who are the holy places? Beis HaMikdash and shuls in Yerushalayim, that they don't have tzaras. But obviously private homes in Yerushalayim could have tzaras. And in other places, in the other big shuls and cities are similar to the Mekomis HaMekudoshim in Yerushalayim, where there will not be tzaras, and that answers the question. Continues the Gemara, Udekrochim ein metami benegoim. This third answer of the Gemara, we said that the Brisa that says that shuls do not have tzaras is referring to krochim, to the shuls of big cities, who the people that the shul is serving and the owners of the shul are unidentified at all, and therefore there's no Nagoim. Is that true? Well, Tanya, this seems to contradict a following Brisa. Achuzaschem, as we saw before, the Pasuk says that Tzaras can only be metame, can only apply to part of, to Eretz Yisrael, which was inherited by Klal Yisrael. Achuzaschem metame benegoim, only that which is inherited by Klal Yisrael can be subject to Nagoim. Ve'ein Yerushalayim metame benegoim, but Yerushalayim is not included in Achuzaschem. That's what the Tanakama says. Omer Rabbi Yehuda argued and said, Ani lo shomati elo mokim migdosh bilvad. I only heard that the Beis HaMikdash is not included in Achuzaschem, but Yerushalayim is included in Achuzaschem. That's the end of the Brisa. And the Gemara says, Ha botik nesiyis ubotim mejoshis metamin benegoim afal gav de krochim ninu. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he says that the Beis HaMikdash is not included in Achuzaschem. The rest of Yerushalayim, including the shuls there, they are part of Achuzaschem, even though it's a big city. So the question is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's clear that the shuls in Yerushalayim can have Nagoim. It's contrary to what we saw before. And why exactly the Gemara chooses to focus on Rabbi Yehuda with this question is discussed here by Tosfos. And why, even though Yerushalayim is called an inheritance according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Beis HaMikdash is not called Achuzaschem, is something which we'll soon see a little bit in the Gemara, but there's a discussion here in Rashi and many other Rishonim. It's very complicated, but either way, even if Yerushalayim was inherited by Klal Yisrael, and we'll soon see in the Gemara that the opinion that says Yerushalayim was inherited, that includes the Beis HaMikdash, was also inherited by specific tribes and Shvatim in Klal Yisrael. Nonetheless, Rabbi Yehuda says the Mokim HaMikdash is not included in the bracket of Achuzaschem, and it's a big discussion why. But that's the question of the Gemara. From Rabbi Yehuda, you see that the shuls in Yerushalayim can have Nagoim, even though it is Krochim, it's in a big city, and this seems to contradict what we said before, the third answer in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Ema, Omer Rabbi Yehuda, change, no, you're right. what Rabbi Yehuda said, he didn't say that Beis HaMikdash stands out and the rest of Yerushalayim can have Nagoim. No, he said, Ani lo shamati el mokim mekudesh bilvad. What Rabbi Yehuda actually meant was only a mokim mekudesh, meaning all shuls, Bate Knesiyos, Bate Medrash, they don't have Nagoim, but not necessarily just Beis HaMikdash doesn't have Nagoim. All the other shuls and Bate Medrash in Yerushalayim also don't have Nagoim because they're in a big city. And then that conforms what we said before, that even though it may have been inherited by specific tribes, nonetheless, since the owners of these particular buildings are not clear, because people from all over the place are coming and using them, benefiting from them, therefore there's no Nagoim there. Now the Gemara is saying, B'maiko miflegi, the Machlokes Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, whether Yerushalayim was, whether the concept of Nagoim applies to Yerushalayim or not. What's the point of their argument, or what they're arguing? Tanakama Sova Yerushalayim lo nischal kol hashvatim. The Tanakama hold that Yerushalayim was never distributed, was never given and inherited to the Shvatim. Rabbi Yehuda Sova Yerushalayim nischal kol hashvatim. Rabbi Yehuda says that Yerushalayim, as well as the Beis HaMikdash, was nischal kol hashvatim. And we're about to see two brises. In the first brise, it will be clear that Yerushalayim was inherited to Klal Yisrael, and the second brise, it will be clear that not. What does it say in the first brise? The Tani we learned in the brise. So here we already see the answer. The Beis HaMikdash, Yerushalayim, the Har HaBayis, and the Beis HaMikdash was given to the Shvatim. We know that the Beis HaMikdash was actually split by two Shvatim, Yehuda and Binyamin. This brise is discussing which parts of the Beis HaMikdash were in Yehuda's share and which parts were in Binyamin's share. Ma hoyo b'chelkei shel Yehuda. Which part was in Yehuda's share? Says the Gemara, Har HaBayis. This is the brise is saying the entire Mizrach, the east of Har HaBayis, Halishkos, all the chambers that were in the Chel, which was a small area, narrow area around the outside walls of the Beis HaMikdash, also talking about the eastern side, V'ha Azoris, the three Azoris, which means the area which covers and was flash with the Ezras Noshim, and then the Ezras Yisrael, and then the Ezras Kohanim, which is the entire area of the Mizrach, of the Har HaBayis, up until flash with the Mizbeach in the Azora. All that belonged to Yehuda. What belonged to Binyamin? The Ulam, which was the little area before the Heichal, and the Heichal, which was where the Menorah was, and the Shulchan, and the Mizbeach, the inside Mizbeach, Ubeis Kochei Kedoshim, which means the entire area which is inside the Ulam, the Heichal, and the Kodesh Kedoshim, all that belonged to Binyamin. The question is that there's a whole area in between these two, between the edge of the Azoros, which is the beginning of the Mizrach side of the Mizbeach, and the Ulam. There's a large area there, and the Brisa didn't tell us in whose area that was. So the Maisa, it belonged to Binyamin. It means Binyamin was not only the Ulam, Heichal, and Kodesh Kedoshim, it was the entire area, including the Mizbeach. However, the Mizbeach, we know that there was the Yisoid, the foundation, the lowest Amma of the Mizbeach was wider, an Amma wider than the rest of the Mizbeach, and that was called the Yisoid. This Yisoid actually went along protruded from the Mizbeach on the Tzofan side, on the north, and on the Ma'ariv side, on the west. Now regarding the Dorim side, which is the south, and the Ma'ariv and the Mizrach side, which is the east, there was only a little bit of Yisoid. There was just an Amma of Yisoid protruding in those two corners, which means that the Yisoid actually covered two entire sides of the Mizbeach, an Amma of each of the remaining two sides. But on the Mizrach side and the Dorim side, besides for that Amma, there was no Yisoid. Now this Amma, this one Amma that was flash on the Mizrach side of the Mizbeach, just beyond the Yisoid was just one Amma on the corner of Tzofin. The rest of that side, that really could have belonged to Binyamin, because the Mizbeach was in Binyamin's share, and the Yesoid was part of that, and the Yesoid protruded that Amma. However, there was that strip along the Mizrach side of the Mizbeach, and a strip going along the Dorim side of the Mizbeach, flash to the Yesoid that protruded just for an Amma on the corner of Dorim Ma'ariv. If you have a diagram, whatever I'm saying will be easily understood. So that strip going around the Mizbeach where the Yesoid was missing, that even though it should have been in Binyamin, but that was given to Yehuda. This strip that we just explained went out of Yehuda's part, and Yehuda's part, intrinsically speaking, was ended flash with the Mizrach side of the Mizbeach, v'nichnas lechelko shel Binyamin, and so to speak went into the part of Binyamin and belonged to Yehuda. And that was around where the Mizbeach was built. Binyamin HaTzadik, Binyamin, who knew that this is how the Beis HaMikdash was going to be distributed, who was pained, his whole life he was pained, he wanted to absorb even that little bit more. He wanted that little bit more of Beis HaMikdash in his Rishus. Every day, Shenemar, as it says in the Pasuk, he agonized over it kol hayom, all day. Lefikoch, therefore, Zocho Binyamin HaTzadik merited v'naseh ushpizchoin legevura, the Orin with the Torah and the Shechina came from the Kodesh Kedoshim. The reason that he merited that the Orin should be in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which was by Binyamin, was because his whole life he agonized and wanted even more Kedusha than he had. Shenemar, as it says in the Pasuk, Ubein Kseif of Shochin, between his shoulders of Binyamin, the Shechina rested, and that's what he deserved as a result. So you see clearly that not only Yerushalayim, but even the Beis HaMikdash was distributed to the Shvatim, Yehuda and Binyamin. And regarding Negoim, that's different. Rabbi Yehuda, at least according to one version of Rabbi Yehuda, says that Mokim HaMikdash, there's no tzoras, and it's not included in Achuzah for different reasons, which we cannot go into now. Rashi has got an interesting explanation. Many Rishonim argued with Rashi, but that's what the Gemara says here. Now we're going to come to a second brisa that's going to clearly say that Yerushalayim was not distributed to the Shvatim. Yerushalayim lo nischal kol Shvatim, the Tanya. Ein maskirin batim Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to hire homes in Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to rent homes. If you're living in Yerushalayim, it doesn't belong to you. Yerushalayim was never given to a particular tribe or person, and therefore you have no right to rent it to anyone else. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok Omer, afloi mitos. Not only that, but even beds in Yerushalayim you are not allowed to rent out. Lefikoch, and therefore, in order to encourage the people who were living in Yerushalayim to allow the people who came for Aliyah L'Regel to be with them, therefore the Chachomim instituted that oiros kochim, the skins, the hides of the korbanos, bale ushpezichnin noitli noisam bezroya, that the hosts, they have rights to them, and they can even take it by force from their guests, as sort of to compensate from the fact that they cannot take rent for their beds and for the space in their homes. Omar Abai said, Shema Mino, we see from here oirech ara, that it's common and it's correct practice lemishbak inish, that a person should leave gulfa, jug, moshcha, and skins leushpizia, by a host. If somebody hosted you, leave over a tip, leave something extra. Continues the Gemara, and now we're going back to the Gemara, the top line of the Amud. The third explanation that we saw before. We had two brises where the shuls can become tomei with negoim. The third explanation was that the shuls of the krochim of the big cities, they do not become tomei because one cannot tell who the owners are. The kforim, however, the shuls of the little villages, they can become tomei. We know exactly who is using and owning the shuls. Asks the Gemara, the kforim, the shuls of these villages, mi metame benegoim, they can become tomei with taras, with negoim. V'tanya, this seems to oppose a brisa. The brisa says, la'achuzah. It's the pasuk we saw before, that kisavoyu el eretz Canaan ani noisin nochem la'achuzah, that we're talking about Eretz Yisrael that was given to Klal Yisrael as an inheritance. What does that mean? That the tzaras will only start applying after it's been fully inherited by Klal Yisrael. Even after Klal Yisrael came to Eretz Yisrael, there were a number of stages before and phases before Klal Yisrael actually, number one, conquered Eretz Yisrael, number one, distributed Eretz Yisrael, and even after it was distributed, it was first distributed to Shvatim, to tribes, then to families, and then every individual was given his home, his lot. All that took time. So the Brisa says, La'achuza, ad sheyichbashu oisa, that tzaras will only apply after they have conquered Eretz Yisrael. That took 7 years. Kovshu oisa v'lo yichalku al Shvatim, after they conquered it, but they have not yet distributed it. It took another 7 years to distribute Eretz Yisrael. Cholku l'shvatim, after they distributed it to the tribes, v'lo cholku l'beis avos, but they did not yet distribute it per family. Cholku l'beis avos, ve'ein kol echod ve'echod makires sheloi. If they distributed it to families, but every single individual owner was not clear yet exactly which lot was his. Minayin, how do you know that tzaras does not apply? Talmud Lema says in the pasuk, that the pasuk says that tzaras applies when the person actually owns his home. The owner of a home he comes to the kohen, misha miyuchad loy, and only somebody who the home is miyuchad to him. That means it's not good enough to know who are the collective owners of this property, because then Beis Av would have been enough. This property belongs to this family. No, we see clearly from the pasuk Asheloi Abayis that it has to be clearly defined exactly who owns what. In which case, these shuls of the villages, it's true that we know that the shul belongs to all the people in this village. It's not like the big cities where the shul, we have no idea who it belongs to, everybody comes to use it. People come from all over the world and gather there. No, that's not enough. It has to be that it's unique. We know exactly what belongs to who. The shuls in the villages, we don't know exactly what part of the shul belongs to who. And this is a contrary to what we said before. And the Gemara says, you're right, the correct way of explaining the contradiction between the two brises where the shuls can become Tomei with Negoim or not, is Kedushanin on Mikara. It's not this third answer, it's the other answers in the Gemara that we saw before that is dependent on the Machlokes Reb Meir and the Rabbanon, if it didn't have a Beis Dira, or it depends whether it had a Beis Dira. And either way, there it's clear that the Negoim apply because of a specific dwelling place by a specific person, as we saw in the bottom of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. But indeed, in the shuls, in the villages where you cannot tell what part of the shul belongs to who, it's not clearly defined, there's no tzaras there, and therefore that third answer falls away. And in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.